Good evening. Welcome to Superpower Broadcasting. I'm Kevils Castley. Thanks for tuning in tonight. We're debating alien Milsrow and interventionism. So this one's kind of a meme. A lot of people have been expecting this for a long time because I debated Milsrow a long time ago, over
Yeah,
a year ago, 5v1. And
exactly.
and yeah, no, you're right. You're right. You get 1v1. Everybody gets a 1v1. So here we go.
Fantastic. Okay, so do you want to start off with just some like opening statements of like
Yeah,
what the
yeah.
basic
Well,
premise is?
I figured, the usual format is because you're the challenger, you get to open with 3 minutes or so opening statements of a rebuttal, and then we can get into basically free form debate, unmoderated debate. So,
Okay,
um,
cool. So basically, my idea is when I think about like what America is, I think that we're a union of the people. We say that we're by and for the people, meaning the citizens of the United States. And I think that when we think about it in that context, that therefore our obligations are solely to the people of our country. So in the same way that I wouldn't expect a union, let's say, to represent people who are not part of the union, I similarly wouldn't expect a country to represent people who are not part of the country. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have obligations in terms of people outside of the country, but the obligations are not in terms of what we have to do, but rather what we can't do. So I would be very frustrated if I saw, let's say, Microsoft, which I think is ultimately responsible for protecting the interests of the shareholders of Microsoft and the people who work at Microsoft, right? But I'd be very frustrated if they did things that were illegal or if they did things that were immoral in order to screw over the people who belong to Apple. That would be unfair. That would be unacceptable. Similarly, I think that there are certain things that America can do that are unacceptable in our relationship to other countries. But I don't think that we have any obligations to those countries so long as we're not hurting them. That's basically the basic premise.
okay. Well, my view of it is that the United States isn't just a typical country; that it's a superpower, and it's a superpower unlike any in history before, because it's not what you would typically think of as an empire throughout history where the goal of it was simply to take over territory and acquire slaves and that kind of thing. America is predicated on a different value system and understanding, which is largely an ideology of liberation, basically an ideology of liberty. And and so for the United States, it's very clear that as the world superpowers, in the post Cold War era, it was the hegemon of the world. And these days, unfortunately, rivals in Eurasia are encroaching upon that. But the U.S. still stands out atop of that. It's very clear that the United States interests don't just begin and end, at the coastline. That your security in the United States is intrinsically interlinked with the security and the stability of other nations throughout the world. In addition to, of course, the moral foundation upon which America was established, the idea that all men are created equal, the idea that tyrants are to be despised and overthrown. And it doesn't make much sense, honestly, in my view, to advocate for democracy, advocate for any manner of productive and enlightened uh, organization within America, if you admit and say, okay, but it doesn't actually matter any of these values that we proclaim to be, uh, you know, basically revealed truths. It doesn't matter what we stand for, because, well, we don't actually care about it right outside of our borders. And so my view of it is, if you say we're okay with fascism over there, even if the fascists over there don't invade you, which I can make a very good case for why they would invade you if we were to take your foreign policy, but let's say they don't, how long is it before the people submit to fascism at home, because they've already admitted that democracy doesn't really mean anything and has no universal value? How long before America comes to look like the rest of the dictatorships in the world if people don't
Yeah.
see these
So
values as universally true?
so there's a couple of things that are going on there. So can we just sort of take that one by one?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question is you're saying that the existence of tyranny outside of the country is a threat to tyranny and to our safety in our own country. it is obviously the case that there are people who are going to, in one way or another, threaten the safety of the United States who are outside of the United States. I obviously grant that. It would be silly not to. That said, I am curious. You also sort of said that tyranny outside of the country, if we're okay with it as a country, that means that we would be okay with it internally. Can you just sort of elaborate on that in a way that distinguishes the United States in that context from another country, or similarly would distinguish, because presumably you would say that like you can believe in labor rights within your country, within your company. You can believe that like I am the CEO of Microsoft. I have obligations to Microsoft. I have an obligation to the people of Microsoft, and that doesn't require that you have a position and that you're like actively stopping bad things from happening at a different company that you don't have any relation to, right?
Yeah, so it's a bad analogy because the corporate world, you might have other corporations out there across the street, from your headquarters where, oh, maybe the people there don't get paid as much, or maybe they've had a bad year financially, but nobody across the street in New York at a rival firm is getting tortured to death and their children gassed and mutilated. Whereas in the real world, in matters of international relations, we're not talking about different businesses competing with one another. We're talking about the civilized world and basically islands of freedom pitted against continents of slavery. And so the people of America have access to see what goes on outside of their borders. And so if the people of America look at absolute barbarity, and I'm not even talking right now in a matter of security threats. We can get into that after, but if you look at what happens in North Korea, you look at what happens in Russia, you look at what happens in Syria, you look at what happens in Rwanda, you look at what happened in Iran, and you look at all of that and you say, you know, we don't actually care. We're going to bear witness to genocide and tyranny and fascism and communism. We're going to bear witness to this. We have the capacity to intervene, but we're not going to. But
Yeah,
don't get me
I
wrong,
don't.
bro. But don't get me wrong, bro. I love democracy and everything here. How long? My question is, how many generations is it of that attitude before people say, what's even the point of democracy here? How long before a fascist
Kevin,
weasels their way into
you're
power?
sort of you're doing two separate things that's going on here. One thing that you're saying is there's a concern about people exterior, and there's the second question of the people internal. So like I can absolutely. I know you don't like the example of Microsoft versus Google, and that's fine. But let's instead go to let's say you're Chicago versus Philadelphia, right? I don't think that the mayor of Chicago has an obligation to the people of Philadelphia. I think he has an obligation to the people of Chicago. Now, obviously, he shouldn't screw over the people of Philadelphia, but his obligation is to Chicago, the people who voted him into office. His obligations are to the people who he represents. And so I don't know why, if you're in charge of deciding how, let's say, you're going to go about building transit for Chicago, which is a really important thing that doesn't just affect the people of Chicago, but affects the people who live in the surrounding cities. It will affect, in fact, the country as a whole, right? But I don't think that if you're responsible as mayor of Chicago, that you should be tailoring your transit that will absolutely affect people outside of Chicago to help anyone other than the people of Chicago. Is that fair?
Well, look, if we're talking about mayors, yeah, they are elected to represent a certain
Sure.
constituency. But this is why that's a bad analogy, because you would have to agree with me that both Philadelphia and Chicago have fundamental human rights. It's not like they're torturing kids to death in Philadelphia for the glory of their mayor, right? Because maybe then the mayor of Chicago might have something to say about what's going on in Philadelphia. And I would say he or she would have a point.
Do you think that it's fair to say that there are places in this country that have unacceptably terrible water access, for example? Flint, Michigan would be an example.
That's hysterical. Flint, Michigan has a higher standard of living than most places in the world.
Okay. I'm talking about in the context of the United States, comparative to the other cities in the surrounding area. Is it fair to say that other cities in Michigan have comparatively, in the same way that you might say that like even places like Puerto Rico, which are obviously not in the same situation as say Connecticut or New York, right, are part of America, and America as a whole is better off than other countries. Is it fair, similar to say that there are cities within Michigan that are equivalently like orders of magnitude better off in terms of water access, orders of magnitude better off in terms of education quality than is Flint?
Well, the issue there, right, is what do you do about it? And so the problem
Well,
that
there are
the problem of
solutions, right?
Milsrow, I know where you're going with this. You're going to say, well, how can you focus on foreign policy when there's potholes and bad water in
No,
Flint?
no.
The U.S. is the
My
richest.
question. That's
The
not my.
U.S. is the
That's
richest. U.S. is the richest superpower in the history of the world. The U.S.
okay.
can do both. You can
I
multitask as a superpower.
So I don't know the answer to which is the richest city in Michigan, but presumably there are rich cities in Michigan, right? So why is the rich city of Michigan not giving out, let's say 20, 30% of their money to try to help out Flint? They could.
Well, they do. No. They do. If you
The
look at
state money does, but
no, no,
not
no.
the local money.
No. If you look at top income earners in Michigan, I don't know like some of the nice areas over there. I guess Ann Arbor is probably like a pretty high
Sure. Let's
GDP
take Ann
place.
Arbor. Sure.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they get taxed above 30% on the
The
margin.
state
Some of
does.
those,
Right. If you're talking about state money, now if we
yeah.
wanted to talk about the UN, I would agree with you that there is a value of an international community and there's a value of international governance, right?
Wait, I'm
Collective
against
governance.
the UN.
Okay, so we can get to that. But first I want to talk about the city versus city. So I'm asking at a base level, if you think not at the state level, but rather at the city level, if you think Ann Arbor has an obligation to give 20%, 30% of the money that they have raised internally as part of the city revenue that would otherwise be going to educating their own children, that would otherwise be making their own bridges better and all of that stuff, would go to their police department, their fire department, instead to spend that on Flint.
Well, you can have things like equalization payments. I mean, in Canada here, Alberta contributes net tax revenue towards Quebec, which receives tax revenue, for example, because Quebec is economically
You're
less
describing
productive
right, but you're
than
just
Alberta. But that's something for the state to determine. That's something for the voters to basically, more or less adopt it through their representatives, a tax code, a financial priorities code, etc., in which the state allocates the resources of the public purse towards different, say, infrastructure projects, that sort of thing. The
yeah.
point that you're
So
missing, I think the point that you're missing here is that we're not talking about, people that make like say 30,000 a year versus people that make 80,000 a year when we're talking about international relations. We're talking about
I don't care.
People that are literally getting gassed to
Yeah,
death. That's not going on in
no.
Flint.
You're missing
That's
the
why.
point that I don't care. It could be literally the people of Flint are generating $10 a year, and the people of Ann Arbor are making $10 million a year on average, right? And it still wouldn't matter. It still would be that fundamentally the state government is responsible for the totality of the state, and that includes both people of Flint and also the people of Ann Arbor. But the Ann Arbor government is responsible for Ann Arbor. And that's the people who elected them. And those are the people who the mayor of Ann Arbor are responsible for. The city council of Ann Arbor is reliant on the votes of, and ought rightly, from a moral perspective, to be focused on the necessities of the people of Ann Arbor.
Okay, but you understand that the security of a city, the purview of a city council, stop within that city because you're within the context of a greater political structure that provides for that security. In other words, the state, in this case, the United States of America. Once you step outside of that, we have anarchy in the world. Now, liberal internationalists will try to tell you, well, no, we have institutions that regulate norms, but that's not really true. For all intents and purposes, the world is chaos once you extend it to the level of states. And so, in that context, states have to look out for themselves. And actually, as you'll find, it is the case that if you are concerned about your security in the context of anarchy, it's actually in your interest to be on their border and not let them come to your border. That's how you ensure your security, is by having a
Yeah.
very robust and extensive presence on their borders, like Russia and China, so that they don't get that advantage on your border. That because
So
it's anarchy. So if they invade you and you lose, You don't get to cry uncle and go to the world police. You're just done. You get enslaved and they win. That's how it works, right?
So I think that this is an interesting point that you're saying that the goals and the concerns of the United States don't end at the borders of the United States. I agree with you. Presumably, you'd likewise grant that the goals and concerns of Ann Arbor don't stop at the border of Ann Arbor either.
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
Okay.
I wouldn't agree with that because
actually, can I defend that and then you can sort of attack it?
Okay, but I think I've already explained how countries are different than cities.
Yeah, I just want to defend it. So when I think of why Ann Arbor is protected, you're right that part of the reason Ann Arbor is protected is because of the existence of the state, and is part of and because that state is part of the United States. And so yes, that is obviously a reason that they don't have to be concerned about certain things like money, right? They have the same money as the other cities near them. They don't have to be concerned about, their military protection. They have to be concerned about the police, but that's basically the fire department, that kind of stuff. But they don't have to be concerned about is anyone going to nuke them? They don't have to be concerned about all of these things that are controlled and that are that they have access to this giant benefit of this larger community that is protecting that smaller, more insular community. So in that context, there are multiple layers of defense that the people of Ann Arbor are experiencing. They're experiencing the level of defense of the city. They're experiencing the level of defense of the state. They're experiencing the level of defense of the nation. Now, if we want to talk about this international community, I understand you're opposed to the UN. I am very much not opposed to the UN. I would not be opposed to the UN becoming much stronger than it is currently. I think that having a larger and stronger international community to be focused on this broader level of defense at the international level would benefit lots of places, but I think it would particularly benefit places like the United States that are already well off to begin with. I think that having states, having an ability to have strong train systems, strong ability to trade across the entire country benefits places like Ann Arbor, benefits places that are fiscally powerful, and that obviously would include the United States in the international scale, more than it helps places like Flint, Michigan, more than it might help places like Ecuador or Guinea. So
that's a lot, and it's wrong. It's incorrect. As I've pointed out many times, the big misconception about the United Nations is that it was a good idea and it got corrupted over time. The fact of the matter is, and I studied the United Nations in university, I did 6 years of Model United Nations. The fact of the matter is that the United Nations, since its inception in 1945, was a compromise between good and evil. And the only exception in its entire history when it didn't act as such was during the time that the Soviets had boycotted the United Nations, allowing for the UN to actually issue a police action by the Security Council in 1950 to intervene to stop the North Korean invasion of the South. That was the only time the UN has acted in a good manner that I would see as satisfactory. And of course, the Russians learned their lesson and they have never boycotted it since. The UN in recent times has, of course, become even more entrenched in towards the side of the continents of slavery. We've seen, for example, hundreds of resolutions passed in the General Assembly per year that target Israel, in contrast to less than a dozen that target multiple countries such as Iran and North Korea, which are actively engaging in committing some of the worst human rights abuses in human history. And so the United Nations is a joke. Everything good that the UN does, like peacekeeping and refugee aid and relief, can all be done by NATO. And everything bad that the UN does, we can kick to the curb and tell the Russians and Chinese to go fuck themselves. So that's my attitude there. But we can get back to the analogy about cities within Michigan if you're interested. I just got to ask you though, Milsrow, what's your solution to Flint then?
My solution to Flint is to have, the reason Flint happened in the beginning was because of a fucked up governor, right? But I think the solution should be at the state level, and I think the solution should be at a national level. And I think that ultimately it should be at a citywide level. But the problem is that the city alone is not able to fix it. So just as I think that when we're thinking about how to protect states or how to protect even countries, I think the way to do that is by appealing to the larger organization that would arise above them. So ideally, you'd have a neighborhood that's able to protect itself, and you wouldn't even need help help from the city level. But if that's not possible, you need the city. If that's not possible, you need the state, you need the country, etc., going all the way up. So your concern about NATO versus the UN.
Before we move on to that,
yeah, go for it. I'm sorry.
Before we move on to that, I just got to say, what about your solution to Flint would be so vastly expensive that it would preclude having a robust foreign policy? Why not be able to do both? Why not both?
I'm a little confused. Repeat that.
Okay. What about solving the infrastructure issues in Flint would preclude being able to afford to maintain a strong security presence?
What did I say we couldn't have a strong security presence?
Well, I argued for interventionism and why it was morally justified, and you talked about Flint for 15 minutes, so you explain.
So my stance is that the United States unilaterally should not be making decisions on how to control the totality of the international community. That was my stance. It does not mean that the international community shouldn't exist. It does not mean that there should not be circumstances where the international community is called to action.
What international community are we talking about? I'm a unilateralist. I support unilateral action in most cases.
Would you say the same at the state or city level?
No, I've already explained how they benefit from the sovereignty of having a legitimate government that can lay down the law across the board. So you understand, right, Milsrow, that the international level is anarchic, but within countries, there's order. And so we have different standards in a country with law as opposed to a world where there is no law.
My concern here is that I think that you're getting lost and part of this might just be that we might have different definitions of countries. I don't think that countries are a hard and fast thing. We were started as these United States. We were not started as the United States. And the reason we're called these United States is because we were originally 13 separate colonies. We were originally 13 separate powers that decided to come together on certain issues. We were much closer to the European Union when we were founded than we are to what we are today. We were not like any number of other countries that from their founding were a single country, right? Is that are you willing to accept that as a premise?
Well, it's just goofy though, because when we talk about countries, we're talking about the states that are largely recognized right now. A little over 193 roughly at the moment, and you can talk about how where did we define when they began? Maybe there's some dubiousness about their founding myths, especially the older you go back. But for all intents and purposes today, when I talk about countries, just say I'm talking about political, territorial entities of the state, where the state has the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within and force within.
Right, but the point that I'm making is that those change over time. The legitimate wait. So the legitimate force of violence in the context of the United States originally was at the militia level, right? It was at the state level, right? There was a huge question. Basically, the whole question of the founding first many hundreds of years, arguably the Civil War, was about the question of whether we were a country or whether we were a number of states, right?
No, that's not true. It was the United States. It was separate states. It was one country.
We weren't from the get-go. The point is just as a matter of historical record.
I guess maybe there's some there's some confusion here. When myself and political scientists talk about the state, we're not talking about the state of Texas. We're not talking about the state of Michigan.
Not now.
We're talking about the institution. We're talking about the institution of the state, which goes back thousands of years.
No, I understand what you're stating here. The problem is that as a matter of historical record, the state, as described that you proposed right there, was the state of Virginia at the time of our founding as a country. That is not true today, but it was at the time of our founding as a country. We were these United States. We are now the United States.
So I'm talking about today. America's way more based today than it was back then. It was pretty cringe back then. Slavery existed back then.
Sure.
That was pretty cringe.
I agree. Sure. Right. But the point, though, is that my point here is simply to state that, and I think it was interesting that you pointed to NATO, right? You were saying that the UN has made a bunch of fuck ups, and I agree with you. And you were proposing that a lot of the stuff that the UN is doing should probably be done by NATO.
Well,
One of the
I
things that
didn't. No, no, no. I didn't just say. I would just want to be clear here. I didn't just say
Mhm.
that the UN has done a bunch of fuck ups. Like, oh, it's a good guy, but it fucked up a bunch of times. It's systematically. It's by design fucked up. It's always been. It's a compromise between good and evil. How can you have 5 veto powers where 2 of them are dictatorships, and
Wait, but
then say
Kevin, you
it
were
fucked
just
up? Of course, it's by design. It's going to fuck up. That's the
yeah.
feature.
So we were just talking about the foundation of our country, and I assume we were both just agreed that slavery is obviously evil, right? So the foundation of our country was built on the 3/5 lie that black people are not fully human, right? Like there were in the compromising of creating our country, we compromised the rights of black people, of women, of non-landowners, of a huge number of people, right?
Yeah, and it's a lot better today because the
Right. But the
United
point
States
though,
Constitution, because the United States Constitution allows, and the United States political system allows for amendments,
sure.
reform, and progress in a way that countries like North Korea would never happen. You can fast forward on North Korea a million years, and if we don't do anything there, they're going to look the same as they do today. So,
But my concern, though, is that you seem to be permissive of the compromise that is by its very nature necessary for the creation of the United States as it exists today. And I certainly agree that the United States is better now than it has been at any other point in our history. Um, but I don't think that you can fairly say that we were good from the get-go. I think that the UN, when it was started, and certainly the League of Nations when it was started, were like profoundly bad, were profoundly not perfect. And similarly, I would say that at our founding as a country, we were profoundly bad. We were profoundly not perfect.
and you think the UN is good today? The
That's
UN
not
is
what.
worse
That's
today
literally
than
the
it was
opposite.
in 1950.
That's literally the opposite of what I just said. What I said is that the UN started imperfectly, and similarly, the United States started imperfectly. And in both cases, they were it started as a loose collection of people and of groups that did not necessarily agree with each other and did not necessarily like each other particularly that much.
Except that the United States Constitution explicitly allowed for the perfection of the Union, whereas the United Nations is entrenched in basically recognizing the legitimacy and the permanent veto presence. They're literally the P5, which stands for Permanent Security Council members of Communist China and Fascist Russia. Those guys always get to be there. So the
Yeah.
UN is incapable
Who
of
wrote the
reforming in
charter?
a way.
Who wrote the Charter of the United Nations?
Well, a conglomerate of different countries, basically, back in the tail end of World War II, and it included the Soviet Union.
Okay. Did it also include Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
Yes, but
Okay. Do
see,
you think
that's the
that?
thing.
So,
So
so when we talk about the foundation of our country, it included, slave owners, right? But it also included people that I think are profoundly important in the history of our country, and I
mm,
think we're ultimately good people. Is that
there's a
fair?
little bit of a difference, though, because we're talking about 17, like basically the late 1770s versus the 1940s. So we're going to judge people by different relative standards in the 1770s. Were there slave owners? Yes, but guess what? Europe was worse. So, I
So
mean, even American slave owners were more progressive than in most of what Europe and Asia were doing at the time. So,
I'm a little lost here because it seems that you're saying that because America is old, the fact that we were founded in, I don't want to say founded in sin, but founded by sinners is okay. But it's not okay to found the United Nations. It's not okay to found even larger, more internationally sort of cohesive
well,
organizations of people now.
I don't like the false equivalence between the U.S. because an aggregation of different colonies to the UN because the US is better and always has been better than the UN. I've argued that the UN shouldn't exist because think about everything good that the UN does. Think about the refugee agency. Think about peacekeeping. You've of course got things like the IAEA and other organizations there. You've got World Food Program, all this stuff. NATO could literally take on all those responsibilities and we then wouldn't have to get lectured on human rights by countries like Iran and North Korea. So why not just have everything good that the UN does go to NATO and all the military stuff that the UN does also just be in NATO?
Yeah.
Why have
So
dictatorships then?
okay.
Why talk to
So
them?
let's. So okay, the Civil War happened, right? I'm going to make a parallel between the Civil War and World War II here. So World War II happened, and after the World War II, basically, I'm making things much more simple than they actually were, obviously. But basically, the Allied powers won, and because the Allied powers won, essentially, Russia and the United States got to decide who was going to control the world, and mostly it was us. We were stronger than Russia at that point in history. Okay, that's what happened there. Now let's look at the Civil War. Basically, the North won and the South lost. Now, I would argue in both cases that the Nazis were like profoundly evil, and similarly that the slave owners were like profoundly evil. I'm not going to get into like which ones was worse. It's not particularly relevant. I'm just saying that like they were both profoundly bad. One way to respond after the Civil War could have been to say, you know what, go fuck yourself. None of you get to be, none of you southern states get to be states anymore. You're now all of you just going to be, you know, brutal sort of work camps for the North. You're going to go back to being, you know, this sort of, you know, semi part of our country, but essentially you're just going to be a colonist, a colonial sort of settlement by the northern states. That's one way we could do it. I would argue that that is similar to suggesting that at the international level, that NATO should be, that the winners of World War II, that the people who are in control should be the ones who get to rule and make the decisions unilaterally for the rest of the world. And I would argue that the UN is much more close to what we did in reality, which was even though they were some pretty awful people still living in those states, we said, okay, you know what? All of you states that were part of the Confederacy, we're going to welcome you. We're going to embrace you back into the country.
Okay, but you're doing a false equivalence again between citizens in the South and states at the UN, because when I talk about people, when we talk about, say, the Russians, we have to distinguish between the people that are enslaved by the Russian oligarchy and the Russian state and oligarchy. They're two different entities. The UN, who does it recognize as representing Russia? The Russian dictatorship. So for you, you're talking about, oh, well, who are we to tell them what to do? Except they tell their own people what to do. So this is the problem, right? If you actually were interested in self-determination, for example, for the people of Syria, you wouldn't look to Assad and ask him, what does he think about Syria? You would look to the millions of people that rose up against him and say, what do you think should happen with Syria?
Yeah.
That they are, but they're not represented at the UN. Assad is represented at the UN.
So one of the things that we did after the Civil War is that we forced that elections actually be complete. And the Reformation was a very complicated component of our history, and admittedly, it did not last as long as it should. And Jim Crow was an atrocious reality of our history. But in the short period after the Civil War, it is true that we forcibly ensured, the Northern power forcibly ensured that certain elections took place, and that those elections genuinely were free elections after the Civil War. Do you think that that's like something that we could be doing in places like Syria at the international level?
I'm an interventionist. I've called for intervention in Syria since the Civil War began 10 years ago.
But there's a difference. There's a difference between
Milsrow. Mm-hmm. Do you support or oppose intervention against Assad?
If it was done at the international level, if it was done by the UN, or if it was done by the United States?
Well, that raises another question, because the fact that you had to answer it that way, that's kind of amazing. So in other words, you would support the war in Iraq if the UN...
Wait, so let's
hold on. This is important. This is important, because this gets at your kind of fundamental value system. So you would support an intervention, say, in Rwanda or Iraq or in Syria if the UN Security Council said it was good, but you would be opposed to it if it was just, say, the US and the UK, or even just the US. Is that correct?
So my answer is yes, but can I explain it?
Yeah, I just want to say, though, before you go into that, I just want to say, so for you, the relative group, the relative consideration here isn't necessarily the people on the ground. It's, did the Russians and Chinese sign off on it as well at the Security Council? That's what matters.
So I think that the actor matters. So let's look back at the Civil War again. Let's propose that instead of having it go into the North and the South, the Confederacy and the Union. Let's propose that West Virginia decided to become its own independent thing, and then just West Virginia, right? This militia from West Virginia decided to attack the Confederacy and decided to take over a huge swath of the Confederacy and decided to make its own laws about how they were going to run the Confederacy. My answer is that the Union, my answer is that the country as a whole should still be against that. So I don't like it if the United States, which is part of the international community, but not the totality of the international community, unilaterally just decides to invade other countries. I think that's a problem.
Hold on a second, though. In this example that you've just given, we have a situation where there's rampant slavery and human rights abuses in the South, and the only state that's willing to bear witness to horror and do something about it is West Virginia. And you acknowledge that there's horror and suffering and misery, but you say that it wouldn't be good to stop it because only one of the arbitrary units in the Union decided to take a moral stand and take matters into their own hands. In other words, you acknowledge that what's happening in Syria is horrible, but unless we can get a bunch of countries together to do something about it, therefore we should just continue to be a bystander. Is that correct?
Do you think that I should be able to invade Michigan? I'm not from Michigan, to clarify. Do you think I should be able to invade Michigan because I think that their water crisis is a problem?
You're welcome to go and volunteer over there. What do you mean invade?
If
do you have like an arsenal of nukes in your basement or something? Like,
sure. Let's say I'm the governor of New York. Should I be able to invade Pennsylvania because I'm really appalled by what Tom Wolf is doing?
You don't have a military if you're the governor of New York.
Sure. Let's propose that I
invade with what army, Milsrow?
Kevin, at the time they did. At the time there was militias. There were local militias. There were militias of the state. Right, they were not of the nation; they were of the state.
I thought we were talking about Flint right now. I didn't realize we were talking about Flint in the Civil War. Okay.
So let's propose. Let's propose that I have the capacity. I am the governor of Indiana, wherever it is, right? And I have the capacity to invade another state, and that other state genuinely is doing bad things. Do you think that I should be able to do that unilaterally as an individual state, or is that bad for the Union as a whole?
Well, if the Union as a whole is looking at and bearing witness to absolute grotesque abuses against humanity, and only one member of that union is willing to do something right about it, then that union honestly is morally fucked. It's not worth its weight. It's not worth the paper in which its constitution is written on at that point. Likewise with the UN. The UN isn't worth the paper that its constitution is written on. It's a bunk and junk project. It should be thrown out and replaced with NATO, which does take a moral stand and doesn't have to be beholden to dead weight cowards that refuse to do anything.
When you say it should be replaced by NATO, are you saying that that just the institution of the UN is faulty, or are you saying that the members of the UN are faulty?
Well, the UN itself, if you've ever read the UN Charter, it's by design. It's by design problematic. It's by design problematic. So here's what I would do. Like the UN would still be a thing. North Korea and all those guys and everything would still go to UN meetings and talk crap about Israel. But if I was in charge, here's what I would say. All Western countries, we're boycotting the UN. We're not going to have anything to do with it. And all functions from peacekeeping and so on and so forth, we're going to do within NATO now. We're going to be, instead of the money that we would have sent to the UN for the humanitarian relief agencies and all that, we're setting up new branches in NATO. We're hiring people, and we're going to do everything through NATO. And it would simply be that. So I mean,
so the goal here is to exclude Russia. The goal here is to exclude Syria or Iran or whatever it might be.
Why would we want to have dictators at the table at the Human Rights Council, for example?
We're coming back to the question of why should we allow a bunch of Southern racists to be part of our governing structure?
But here's the difference. We're in the year 2021. We're not talking about the Civil War. We're talking about making the world a better. We're talking about making the world a better place because it's not good enough. It's not. No, Milsrow, what you're doing is basically an even older school version of. But what about 1953? In other words, You
I'm
can
making
never
a
do.
parallel.
In
I'm
other
making a
words, you can
historical
never do. In
parallel.
other words, you can never do anything good to help the people of Iran because 1953, bro. Likewise with
Kevin,
this,
what?
America can never. America can
I
never do anything
genuinely.
good. America can never do
This is
anything good
such
for
a
the
this is
rest
such
of
a weird
time
straw man.
because
I don't
back in the
understand what this.
1800s, there were slaves. So you
I
understand the
literally
fallacy with what.
I don't even think I've mentioned Iran more than like twice in passing this entire conversation.
And that's kind
My
of a problem. But that's kind of a problem because we're having a debate about interventionism, and you're more
the
interested
premise of
to skirt
interventionism.
to
We're not having a
skirt
debate.
to
We're talking about
skirt
the
the
premise of
topic,
interventionism.
to
The
dodge it
principle.
because it doesn't look good for your side and your
No, we're
position,
talking about the
and
principle of who should intervene.
you want
We're
to
not talking
talk
about
instead. You want to
Kevin.
deflect to
Kevin,
domestic analogies that aren't even
we're not
appropriate, like
talking.
Flint,
We're not talking
Michigan,
about
and the Civil War. So why can't
Kevin.
we just have a conversation about intervention in the 21st century? Why
If
do you
we're
have
going
to
to
do
get to
this?
because if we're
Why
gonna,
can't we
yeah, can
just
I
have a
answer?
serious debate?
Can I answer? If we're going to get to if we're going to get to principle, the way you get to principle is by looking at context, is by looking to parallels and saying, okay, in this parallel context, in this parallel context, in this parallel context, this would be something that makes sense principally. And therefore, because this is something that makes sense principally, we can apply it universally. That's the reason I'm proposing it.
What principle? The principle that we should listen to what butchers have to say
The
instead of the people on the ground?
So the principle is that when you are having governing structures that affect people, that those people should be part of the people who are listened to about how those government institutions function.
Okay. So can you acknowledge, Milsrow, that there are conditions under which a country, a state loses or forfeits its sovereignty? Because Christopher Hitchens outlined 4 in his doctrine. You acknowledge that there are any conditions under which a government is not a legitimate actor anymore and should be dismissed.
When you say government isn't a legitimate actor, are you saying that the current system that is responsible for organizing that country, or are you saying that the people of that country?
I'm talking about the regime, obviously.
Okay.
Of course,
So
you know that. You must know that.
Okay. So yes, there are contexts where the regimes of an individual country should, of course, not be permitted to continue to exist in their context. Yes.
Name an example, and don't say the Nazis. That's the layup. Name one. That's not the Nazis.
Name an example. I've just said this Confederate. The Confederacy is an example.
But the Confederacy, yeah, that's a convenient domestic thing within the United States within the Civil War. Name
You're
one
looking for a modern
in the international level, post World War II, one regime that you would say forfeited its sovereignty for whatever reason, and therefore
wait.
wasn't worth acknowledging as a legitimate state.
You're saying the regime here. You're not saying the country. You're saying the regime here. I would say
obviously.
Okay, I would say the Kim regime of North Korea is a regime that is sufficiently atrocious in the way that it interacts with its people, that I would say that it is a regime that no longer deserves to exist.
So okay, that raises a couple of questions then. So when you say, oh well, it's good, you support this principle of bringing all of the actors of the international community into a place to basically talk.
Mm-hmm.
You don't recognize North Korea as a member of the international community. You recognize them as a rogue abomination. Is that correct?
Is that not the case of the Confederacy with respect to the Union?
I'm trying to have a debate about American interventionism on foreign policy.
But my parallel, my point is that the parallel that I've proposed continues to fit, right?
No, but it doesn't. It really doesn't, because you're talking about a domestic issue, and you already. No. But
no one thought of it as being domestic.
Okay, is a civil war a domestic affair or an international affair? And yes, it can be both. Did the
Confederacy deem itself to be part of the Union?
But I don't recognize the legitimacy of the Confederacy. Obviously, they were like, we're our own country, bro. They weren't. They were part of the United States. That was a domestic issue. The only reason why you would say it wasn't a domestic issue is if you were David Duke or a Klansman. Which is it? Are you a
I don't
Klansman?
even. I don't quite understand what the question is here.
Well, it's not really
Am
a
I a
question.
Klansman?
It's
No, I'm
not.
not.
No, no, no. It's
I
not.
am in fact
It's
Jewish. So I'm not
not.
a
It's
Klansman.
not. It's not a question, Milsrow. It's simple. This is such a meme debate. Oh my god. Okay, so the South, obviously, when they quote unquote seceded, they said, "Oh yeah, fuck you, mom. We're our own country now." But
Okay.
obviously, that wasn't actually the case. Obviously, that wasn't legitimate. They were not a legitimate country, and it was a civil war because the war took place between different groups within the United States of America. So, do you, in
Yeah.
the era of the Civil War, do you see the South as its own country? Or do you see it as a rebellious force within the Union?
I see just as I see North Korea, and I'm actually this is an accident.
Wait,
But
wait,
I'm
wait, no,
glad.
no, 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 no.
Yeah.
So you're saying you
So
see them
Kevin,
as
can
their
I
own
answer your
country.
question? Kevin,
So
can I
you
answer your
see them as
question?
their own. So you
Kevin,
see them as
Kevin,
their own
Kevin, you got to
country.
let me answer the question. You
So
got to
you
let me
see
answer.
them as
Can you
their
let
own
me answer the
country.
question? Can you let me
So
answer
you
the
agree
question?
with David
Could
too.
you could
So
you
you
let
agree
me
with
answer the
David too.
question? Could you let me answer the question? In a similar way that I see Kim Jong Un's regime as illegitimate, but fundamentally and quite obviously in control of a component of Korea, I similarly would say that the Confederacy was fundamentally illegitimate, but quite obviously did have a control of a component of the United States.
So you don't think that was a civil war? You think it was an international conflict?
I think that the Korean War is a civil war, and I think that the
No, I'm
American War
talking
was a civil
about.
war.
I'm talking about
I
the
think
Civil
both
War.
of I think both of them are examples of civil wars. But the fact that they're a civil war does not mean that the Confederacy or that North Korea don't actually just practically control certain borders, right?
Okay, okay. So I got to ask the question again. I want an answer. Was the American Civil War an international conflict?
I don't even understand what the question is here.
How
Like,
ca- how?
because
No,
it's a
no, no, no,
ridiculous
no, no, no,
question.
no, no. Hold on
There's
a
like
second.
so
Hold
many
on a
different
second.
parts of what
Hold
you're
on a
asking.
second.
Like, was
Hold on a
France
second.
involved? Yes, France was involved. Like,
If
was
the
Britain involved at some level?
Confederacy,
Yes. Was there a real question of like how exactly the European powers were going to be involved? Was there a question about Canada? Was there a question about Mexico? Like all of these
okay,
things were
okay,
all
okay.
questions.
Okay, but
Yes, it was an
there
international
wasn't
war.
significant foreign intervention. Okay, let's say this. Let's say this. A better way of phrasing though. Yeah, because technically yes, Britain and France had stances on the Civil War, but okay. Um okay, let's phrase this better.
And to clarify, similarly,
Was the Civil
okay.
War in America a war between two countries or a war between rebels of a country and the government of a country?
Can you answer the same question about North Korea versus South Korea?
What do you mean? Like, explain that
Yeah.
question.
So is South Korea and North Korea, are those two separate countries, or is that an ongoing dispute and an ongoing civil war that will ultimately resolve, presumably, with one of them controlling the totality of the country?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a civil war. Like
Okay.
Korea is one
Okay. Sure.
country. It's the Republic of Korea.
Sure.
The
So it's a
North
civil war.
happens to be occupied by the communists right now. That doesn't mean they're
Sure.
not part of South Korea. South Korea officially recognizes them as a part of their republic, for
Sure.
example. So,
And so to Vietnam, sure, yeah, obviously there are lots of, sure. Okay, cool. So you're proposing that the totality of Korea. So okay, then my answer would be the same for the United States.
so you actually don't think the Confederacy was its own country. You do think it was just a bunch of rebels within America.
If you're willing to say the same about North Korea, yeah.
Of course, I've never said anything to the contrary. I've always
Okay,
said that
sure.
that is the legitimate territory of the Republic of Korea with its capital in Seoul.
Okay, sure.
Like I've literally argued for
Yeah,
using nukes
sure.
to guarantee that.
Okay. So the nukes part is a question. Obviously, there are questions of how exactly you should deal with hostile territory that is controlled by rebel citizens. But sure, broadly, the idea that Korea generally should be in the hands of the non-Kim component faction, like, is probably valid. I shouldn't say probably, is valid. I would say similarly that there are many different places across the globe where there are certain places that are currently controlled by powers that are not the ones that I deem to be the governance that ought to be in control of them.
Well, this isn't about your personal view or whatnot. It's about what's right. So I'm a moral
Wait,
universalist, as you would know. You would probably
I didn't know
characterize.
you were a moral universalist, but that is interesting. It
Wait,
doesn't shock me,
how?
but
How? I'm like,
Kevin,
you've criticized me for like what, like the whole neocon ghoul shit and everything. Like, of
yeah,
course. So you're a moral relativist. I'm a moral universalist. So when you say, "Oh, well, that's not like that," whether I should say this or not. No, 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 no. Gassing kids like they do in North Korea in the concentration camps is
it's
bad.
bad.
That's not a matter of opinion. That's a matter of truth, right? That's true
Yeah.
anywhere in the universe. That would be true 100 solar systems away. If a regime did that, that would be bad. There's no universe in which that's good.
I don't know how we got here. Yeah.
Well, this is a debate about intervention, and you're an anti-interventionist, and I'm a war hawk.
I'm not that's not what I said. I'm not an anti-interventionist. I'm an anti-American interventionist. I'm an anti-interventionist when it's done unilaterally by single countries without the precedent, without the context, without the permission of the broader community of the international organization.
So you only, in other words, you only support intervention when it's watered down and when the Russians and Chinese sign off on it. I got a question for you. No. I got a question for you though.
How is support from Germany making it watered down? I don't understand how that waters it down.
Well, look at France. Look at what they did with the war in Iraq, for example, the first one, where it wasn't just France. It was a lot of these European powers that said, we'll support you, but only if you don't take out Saddam. Just kick him out of Kuwait, but don't take out the regime. And George W. Bush is like, okay, yes, daddy, basically. And then he didn't go in.
So the Civil War was watered down because we had to get permission from New York and also Connecticut?
No, those are all part of the same country. That was a unilateral thing. So
I thought all of these countries that you were describing were part of the UN.
The UN is not a country, Milsrow.
Oh, I thought the United States wasn't a country either. I thought that it was an organization of states.
No,
I thought that was like the whole question. I thought that was like the whole point.
No.
The
United States is one state.
Now,
and there were rebels within that state that rebelled against the government.
The
United Nations is not a. The United Nations is not a state. It's not a country. It's a meme. That's what it is.
It's an organization of states. It's an organization of governments that has a broader government structure.
Right, but it's not a government. Its authority is non-enforceable, right?
Currently, because it has no military, just as the United States at its founding did not have a national military.
Yeah, and that was kind of cringe. And the U.S. has the biggest military in history now. That's pretty base.
Sure.
And that's pretty
I think it's cringe
base.
that the UN doesn't have a military. That's cringe.
No, what's cringe
I like the idea
that the
we're
UN. No. What's cringe?
Yeah.
What's cringe is that the UN even exists, and you would have to agree with me to some extent here because you even admitted that one of the member states, you don't even recognize their sovereignty, that being North Korea, and yet the UN plays patty cakes with them.
I don't think that the union ceases to exist because I negate the sovereignty of a rebel governor.
But
let's put it this way.
Hold on
let's
a
not
second.
even use the United States.
Hold on a second.
We've been struggling about like whether the United States is one country or multiple countries.
But the reason, no.
Okay.
The reason though is that the Union took out the rebel governor. Who's taking out North Korea? I want to take out North Korea. My guess is here, and maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm going to be wrong on this one because I was surprised when you said that you don't regard them as being a sovereign country in North Korea. But do you support or do you oppose intervention in North Korea? Because it sounds like you're going to say only if Russia and China sign off on it at the UN.
That's what I already answered.
But they're never going to sign off on that. Why would China, Milsrow? I don't know if you know about the Korean War, but China sacrificed 1.5. China sacrificed 1.5 million of their kids to go and die. Mao's own kid died in that war to save Kim Il-sung. China is never going to support the U.S. or whoever going in and putting troops on their border. They're always going to keep that regime, which you regard as not having legitimate sovereignty in place. So you can see how the UN is flawed by design, where it allows for the perpetuation of states that you recognize
to become president
are illegitimate.
To become president of the United States, do you need permission specifically from Texas, or do you need permission from the majority of the Electoral College?
Well, permission. You need to get the majority of the electoral vote.
But
Sure.
not specifically Texas. So similarly,
You could win without Texas. Many presidents have.
Awesome. So similarly, and I'm using Texas because it's the second most important state after California, to clarify. So similarly, like, I think that you can manage to have international support for something without specifically the support of China or specifically the support of Germany. I think that you need to have the broader
but not at the UN.
Support.
Not at the UN. You must be aware of how the Security Council.
We can say that the Security Council is bad.
Security Council. No, Milsrow.
The Security Council gives veto power. I understand what the Security Council is.
Even in a crazy scenario where Russia, America, France, the UK, and 12 other countries or whatever, 9 other countries.
Kevin, you're just arguing against the structure of government at the international level.
That structure can't be reformed, because if anybody proposes to get rid of one of the veto countries, the veto country vetoes it. That structure is permanent.
Kevin, the fact
Milsrow.
This is ridiculous. The fact that there are
Milsrow.
Okay, go for it.
So even in an insane example where Putin's sick of what's going on, Putin has a change of heart and he's sick of what's going on in North Korea, and he approves intervention with military force in North Korea, and the United States, France, and the United Kingdom all agree to it, plus the other members of the Security Council that are non-permanent that happen to be there agree to it, but China vetoes it. So it can't happen. It's not going to pass now. The UN rejects it because China vetoed it. In that case, you've got the majority of states. You've got the 4 out of 5 of the P5, which basically never happens. But in this case, let's say it did, and it still doesn't happen. So when you say you can still do things without getting everybody, you can have the majority at the UN, at the level of security, you can't. You actually have to have the consent of all 5 P5 members. And that's basically the reason why the UN can never do a serious military intervention ever. So I've got a question for you now.
Wait, can I respond before?
Oh, sure, you can respond, but then I have a question about the multilateral thing.
Cool. So you have described, and I agree to this at the outset, and I agree to it still, that there are profound problems with a structure that we have designed for the League of Nations, and similarly, there continue to be problems with its replacement with the United Nations. There are real problems, and I agree. Similarly, I think that there are real problems, not as intense, but real problems with the fact that you can become president of the United States without getting the majority of the votes. I think it's a real problem that you can control the Senate when you don't necessarily have even close to 50% of the people having voted for you to get to control the Senate. I think it's a real problem that we have gerrymandering. I think it's a real problem that we have voter suppression. I think there's lots of problems. Kevin, I'm not saying that these are equivalent in degree.
We're comparing in kind. So we're comparing the fact that you can win an election in America and technically get 48% of the vote with kids getting gassed in concentration camps in North Korea.
What? No,
so that's what we're doing. No. That's what you're doing. That's what you're doing because you're saying that America has problems too.
I compared the institutional problems of the Electoral College with the institutional problems of the P5 system. That's what I did.
But you can literally be against the Electoral College. No, I'm not.
And I can be opposed to the P5 system.
Oh, okay. But here's the key point. Here's the point that you're missing, Milsrow. Here's a huge pill for you. So I want you to pay attention, because you might actually learn something here. The nature of what the permanent 5 veto power means is that in order to reform it, you need the consent of all the veto players. So you can understand where this is going, right? If we have a motion at the UN where you say we find this system flawed, we want to alter the veto system, or we want to take away the veto, say from China or something, because we don't like what they're doing in Xinjiang, and we want to give it to, I don't know, let's say Taiwan, or we want to give it to Germany instead. Guess what? Even if Russia goes along with it, and France goes along with it, and America goes along with it, and the United Kingdom goes along with it, and the other members that are there go along with it, China says, actually, no, thank you. We don't like that. And they veto it. So therefore, it can't happen. So the system at the UN that you've admitted is institutionally flawed is permanently entrenched like that for the rest of time. So why not get rid of it? And if you want to do this whole, oh, well, we still want something like the UN, why not make a new one? Because you can clearly recognize that the UN is clearly the most conservative institution when it comes to institutional reform. And it's never going to change because the structure means that even if 14 out of 15 people at the Security Council or countries at the Security Council say, yes, we want change, all it takes is for that one country to say, actually, no, we veto it, bro. So China would never agree to what you suggested in North Korea. So therefore, it would never happen. So can you at least acknowledge that the system that you just admitted, which is institutionally has problems, can never reform itself, unlike the American Constitution, which can.
Okay, that was a long time to say the question, but I understand the question. Okay, so yes, there are institutional problems with the UN. There are institutional problems with America. The problems of the institution of the UN are larger than the institutional problems of the United States. Our Constitution is designed to make it very difficult to repeal something that is a constitutional right. We have repealed a constitutional right. We had a constitutional amendment that said that prohibition is now a thing, and then we appealed the prohibition as a thing. It was very difficult to do so. It was possible to do so. If you're saying that it might be impossible to change the UN, that might hypothetically be true. I don't think it's true, but it might hypothetically be true. Yeah, it might hypothetically be true that we can't change the UN, that we can't get rid of the Security Council without simply abolishing the UN and starting over from scratch. We've done that before. We had the League of Nations. We started over, right? And I think that it is perfectly reasonable to start over again because, in particular, in the case of the UN, you're right. The UN does not have a military yet. It's not particularly hard to start over from the UN context. It's not particularly difficult to change to change the charter. It's not particularly difficult to make the changes that are necessary in order to have a thriving international community. I think that is possible. I think that is necessary.
But if you were to redo it, because for me, I don't just want to get rid of the UN and everything it does. I want to get rid of the UN and the good things it does, pass them over to NATO. NATO is a multilateral organization of basically, what is it, like 30 countries. It's not just like the US telling people what to do. It's a ton of different democracies.
It's the US and her allies.
Yes, exactly. The only countries that seriously matter in the world when it comes to listening to what their governments say. Here's the thing, because their governments are elected by their people. Here's the thing. So you mentioned before how you just didn't like that it was just America telling people what to do. Well, here's another example of one that the UN, of course, rejected, vetoed, because Russia wasn't down for this. But a ton of countries agreed, and that was the intervention against the genocide in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, the Balkans. NATO supported it. NATO took it upon itself to go in there, and NATO was a ton of different states that all worked together to stop the genocide there. But the UN said no, it was illegal because Russia vetoed it at the Security Council. Whose side are you on in that? Do you support the intervention against Serbia, or do you think that it was wrong because we should have got permission from the UN, which would have been impossible?
What do you think my answer is here?
I genuinely, I'm guessing you're going to say we should listen to the UN.
Yeah.
Wait, dude, come on. I was hoping you were at least going to surprise me and be reasonable here and say, okay, I'm not a unilateralist, but I can get it when like dozens of countries get together to stop a genocide. Maybe they have a point. No, dude, you have a fetish for the UN. It's not even about multilateralism, because this was not the US just going in and being the bully and telling people what to do. This was a ton of different countries
by an international community.
Got together. It was an international community of people that got together and said, well, the UN vetoed this. We're going to take it upon ourselves to do this. And it wasn't just America. It was a ton of different countries. Italy was involved. The UK was involved. And you say no because
it was done by an international community. Because
Yeltsin vetoed it because his buddies in Belgrade, because his buddies in Belgrade wanted to, because his buddies in Belgrade, because his buddies,
I have been trying very hard not to interrupt you, but you keep on interrupting me here. It's kind of frustrating.
Because his buddies in Belgrade wanted to butcher
Kevin,
Bosnia.
Can I answer?
Because his buddies in Belgrade wanted to butcher Bosnia.
Kevin, can I answer?
Well, you already did. You say you take the UN. You say you take their consensus, veto it, no intervention, let the Bosnians get butchered, right?
Why is
Pathetic,
that my answer?
disgraceful, meek and
Right.
weak and lame.
Why is that my answer?
Pathetically lame, dude.
Why is
Lame.
that my answer?
Because you just literally said you picked the UN over NATO.
Why?
Because I guess Russia has some spooky nukies, right? And we don't want to start World War III.
No.
Except World War III never happened. The Russians took it like a little bitch.
That's
they didn't
not
do shit. They didn't do shit. Did they nuke
Eric,
America?
I agree with you.
No,
Eric,
no.
You are
they
correct.
whined.
They
whined. The Russians whined, and then they went back into their corner and didn't do anything, because that's what happens when you're strong.
So when you have an international community and the international community has a mandate, right? The mandate should be done through the international level. And it's frustrating that when you hear the example of the UN failed, right? And I agree with you, the UN did fail in that context. But when you hear the UN failed, your response is not.
It didn't fail.
Kevin,
it didn't fail. It succeeded.
Kevin, it's frustrating that you keep on interrupting.
Dude,
it's frustrating that you keep on interrupting when I'm just trying to answer.
Hey, man, it's frustrating when you interrupt me. You know, back at you, bro. No, you. So,
Kevin,
back
I'm trying to answer. It's not an interruption when I continue to make the statement when you have interrupted. That's not how interruption works. Okay, so if you are saying that the United Nations failed in its mandate and its obligation to exist as an international institution because it has failings, because it has it did not succeed.
It did not succeed. Its job.
You said it succeeded in
protecting you don't get the UN.
Protecting the interests of Russia, or protecting the interests of China, or protecting the interests, frankly, of the United States is not the same as protecting the interests of the international community. If the UN is to be the international community, their job is not to protect Russia specifically or China specifically, but rather the international community writ large. That is a different thing.
That's a meme. Dude, the UN succeeded at doing its job. What is its job? Its job is to uphold the status quo P5 members' hegemony, basically. And Russia didn't want her ally to have to deal with getting a spanking by NATO. And Yeltsin said, no, we don't like it that you're going to try to stop our boys in Belgrade from butchering Bosnians. So he vetoed it. And you say, oh, well, the international community has spoken, except not. There was an international community of dozens of countries that intervened despite the Russians. And you say that I was wrong because Russia said no. And so here's the problem.
Because the UN community does not have
but the UN is not the international community, because many of the member states of the UN are not legitimate states. They don't have legitimate sovereignty. They forfeited their sovereignty. Some of them are funders of terror. Some of them have committed genocide. Some of them are waging wars of aggression. Some of them are in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and acquiring weapons of mass destruction. They don't have legitimate statehood. And so their opinion is irrelevant and can be dismissed. The UN is a joke. It should be abolished, and NATO should be the substitute. Now, let's get back to a little bit about intervention. We do have to wrap up this debate fairly shortly, but I guess my question for you then is that how possibly can a meme body of different diplomats that get together in a swaggy building and talk with each other and make, basically platitudes to one another, how can that be more important in your view and the opinion of, oh, we have to honor what the Security Council said, even though obviously Russia's going to protect their own gangsters? How can that be more important to you than the survival and the existence of an entire ethnicity of people? Like, I honestly feel like your answer to everything that you've just said tonight might change if you were to see the killing fields with your own eyes in the Balkans. I don't.
Yeah,
your position. No, Milsrow. Your position, Milsrow. Your position here. Your position comes from a place of such immense privilege. You've never seen a genocide with your own eyes. yet you feel perfectly fine to lecture people on how it was wrong to stop them because the Russians vetoed it, bro.
Not that it's
That's
wrong
fucking
to stop
pathetic
it.
and embarrassing, and you should be
Kevin,
ashamed of
that's
yourself.
not at all what I said. I have not said it's wrong to stop it. I have said that it's wrong for America to just on its own decide to just,
It wasn't. It was
go ahead and
multilateral.
do
There were
things.
dozens of countries that intervened. A ton of NATO countries intervened. It was not just America. That was not just. And even if it were,
Kevin, if
that
that were
wouldn't change
true,
anything.
if that were true, first of all, the second part of what you just said is my point. But ignoring the second part of what you said and just focusing on the first part of what you said, if it were true that it had international support, it should have changed the UN and created a different UN that was a better UN that did not have a Security Council
No,
that was
that's a
able to
meme.
respond.
That's a meme. So we have to do this magic spell where we say the magic words from an old
Where we have a
tome.
new institution
where
that
we
functions,
have to recite like a 500 word spell like the arcane mystics did back in the day with the druids.
We have to have this mystical thing called, like,
in order for the spell to work, in order for the spell, in order for the spell to work, we also have to gather a ton of stones, but the stones have to come from the highest of the mountains where the gods dwell. And we have to take these and we have to put them in a circle, and we have to have the virgin daughters of the community gathered around in the circle, and then we have the elders recite the 500 magic words, and then they cast and then they cast the goat, and then they cast a goat into the fire in the center of it, and they say thy intervention be it now legitimate.
Listen,
now the magic words have been uttered, and therefore we can now go in, and therefore we can now go into Yugoslavia. And therefore we can now go in, and therefore we can now go into Yugoslavia and save those Bosnians, and save the other, and save the people in Kosovo from being butchered by Yeltsin's thugs in Belgrade. We have to do the magic song and dance. Or how about this? Fuck the UN, fuck my liberal internationalism. And how about this?
Kevin,
NATO. So I can't fucking do this anymore, dude. You're such a joke. We're going to have to move to closing statements because nothing else productive is going to come from this. Nothing else productive is going to come from this. So
at the point where you're talking about like druid spells,
you get your closing, you get your closing statement, and then we're going to wrap this up because nothing else is productive. I mean, your absolute depraved disregard for human suffering and absolute fetishization of dudes in suits at the UN is unbelievably disconcerting and grotesque. So you get your closing remarks, and then we
cool. So I don't know what the hell the last part of that was, where you were talking about like druid spells and shit. I'm just gonna ignore that. To the point broadly, to the idea that we have a government structure that is responsible for making government decisions, I think that is absolutely the correctest way to approach national policy. I think that is absolutely the right way to approach international policy. In order for our country to be able to make proper decisions that genuinely are in the interest of the totality of the United States, the totality of the American people, of our citizens, I think that we have to include the totality of the government, of the people who are going to be governed. And I think it would be appalling if in response to the Civil War, we had simply said, okay, the totality of the South, you are now a colony, and you can go fuck, you can get fucked. You're not going to be part of the voting bloc. I think it's appalling that we don't allow Puerto Rico to vote. I think it's appalling we don't let Guam vote. I think it's appalling that the same, it can be said to some degree, of the people of DC. I think that we have to ensure that people who are represented by government are actually represented by government, not just controlled by government. That's basically my closing remarks. Go for it. Also, I love your tie. Your tie is beautiful.
Yeah, that was a big bundle. That was a big bundle of nonsense. Anyway, the nature, the despicable and grotesque moral character of liberal internationalists has been exposed tonight. The United Nations is a meme. It's a joke. It's pathetic. And my opponent here, even if he were to somehow redo the UN, he would have all the same flaws because we all know that he would be inviting those same usual suspects of Russia and China back to the table because he's already argued against me, saying that NATO should take on the good things that the UN does and the bad things the UN does should be cast to the dustbin of history. So I will close by saying that anti-interventionism and moral relativism are cancers on our society and our civilization, and not only will they rot the moral fabric of our societies from within and doom us to self-destruction in the long run, but they will also expedite that by enabling and exacerbating the advantage to our opponents, the continents of slavery, the rivals in Eurasia, and usher in their domination of the world, while we stand idly by and say, I guess we're the bad guys. And sure, genocide and butchering is going on in the world, but we can't do anything about it, even though we have the means to, because we're bad and unilateralism bad. And Putin said no, bro. So thank you for watching. If you want to debate me, you can check me out over on Twitter and send me a DM. And with that, have a good night, everybody.